Hello, everyone. On behalf of the Pembina Institute, I'd like to welcome you to the latest installment of our webinar series, The Future of Hydrogen, Market and Technology Readiness. I'm Simon Dyer, Deputy Executive Director at the Pembina Institute. To start, I'd like to acknowledge I'm joining you here from Edmonton, Amiskwa Waskahegan, on Indigenous land in Treaty 6 territory. Here on the banks of the North Saskatchewan River, a traditional meeting and gathering place of the Cree, the Saulteaux, the Blackfoot, Dene, Nakota Sioux, and Métis people. My colleagues in Vancouver are hosting today's event from the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. We're grateful for their stewardship of these lands and waters since time immemorial. If you're meeting Pembina Institute for the first time, we're Canada's leading independent climate and energy think tank, known for working with governments and industry and communities to advance a prosperous and clean energy future in Canada. The development and use of hydrogen as an energy carrier and how it can contribute to decarbonizing the economy is continuing to generate discussion and debate. Global commitments and announcements around hydrogen projects and technologies are in the news daily. This webinar will examine international market trends and forecasts for the development and use of hydrogen and discuss market and policy factors that influence industry investment in hydrogen technologies in several sectors. As momentum grows, continued research and dialogue on the relative role of hydrogen and the conditions under which it is developed to contribute as a pathway to net zero are necessary to realize the potential of hydrogen and accelerate its adoption in Canada. At the Pembina Institute, we're keen to move these important conversations forward. On behalf of Pembina, I'd like to thank Fortis BC for supporting this webinar series through their Climate Action Partners program. And we're also grateful to the Real Estate Foundation of BC, the Sitka Foundation, and the North Family Foundation for their generous support of our work. If you'd like to support our work in this important area or learn more about our research, please check out our website at pembina.org. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Tara Jutt, who's our Director of the Clean Economy Program in BC, who'll be today's moderator. Thank you, Tara. Over to you.
Thank you, Simon. Hello, everyone. I'm Tara. I'll be your moderator for today. Just a few housekeeping items. Please note that the webinar is being recorded and will be available on the Pembina Institute website at pembina.org. Just for your information, all participants will be muted during the webinar. We will have some time halfway through to answer questions. Please use the question box in the control panel to type in your questions, and we'll do our best to get to as many questions as possible following the presentations. Without further delay, I'm pleased to introduce our panel of experts. From the International Energy Agency, we have Simon Bennett. From GE Gas Power, we have Jeff Goldmeer. And from Cummins, we have Tracy Krauss. All will share their perspectives on an emerging hydrogen economy. Our first speaker today is Simon Bennett. Dr. Simon Bennett is a technology and investment analyst in the International Energy Agency's Supply and Investment Outlooks Division. He's responsible for new technology analysis in the annual World Energy Investment Report and for innovation workstream of the Clean Energy Transitions Program. He previously coordinated IEA energy technology roadmaps and has focused on policy and technology for hydrogen and carbon capture, utilization, and storage, otherwise known as CCUS. Prior to the IEA, he worked at the European Commission's Directorate General for Energy. He holds master's degrees in chemistry and in environmental technology, and a PhD in environmental technology and energy policy from Imperial College London. Simon, you are our first speaker. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Tara, and thank you to Simon and the Pembina Institute for such a warm welcome today. I'm very pleased to be able to join you and to join all of the guests that are listening in online for this webinar on hydrogen energy technologies and outlooks. And really, my job today, as I understand it, is to provide a little bit of background and context on the role of hydrogen, some of the work that we've done recently to put it into the net zero perspective, and to start the conversation around some of the policy needs. So I'm going to try not to take too much of your time, but provide that international perspective. Now, I hope that many people online are familiar with the International Energy Agency. We are an intergovernmental organization based in Paris. Our members are governments, and that means that our main focus is on trying to do the analysis and the work that provides them with the basis for sound policy decisions in the energy space and across all parts of energy. And I think the first thing to say when it comes to hydrogen is that it really does have the potential to touch all parts of energy. A couple of years ago, I was fortunate enough to be the lead author on the IEA's report, The Future of Hydrogen, and that contains an enormous amount more information than I'm going to be able to talk about today. But in order to be able to produce that report, we had to have people from the IEA's oil refining division, the people who focus on buildings technologies, on industry technologies in iron and steel, on R&D, technology development. Pretty much everybody or every team in the IEA was involved. And I think that really speaks to the breadth of hydrogen. And I will come to this in what I'm talking about, but why it's gathered such amazing traction, I would say, in the last couple of years. So from that report that we did at the request of the G20 in 2019, our sort of most recent big splash, I guess, in the world of energy modeling and climate has been our net zero by 2050 report, which came out last month. So I'm going to use that as a little bit of a background to talk about where hydrogen might get to in the years ahead. So the IEA was asked by the COP presidency of the UK to put together a report modeling what a reasonable pathway might look like to get to net zero emissions globally by 2050. And this really stretched our modelers in terms of trying to work out what an energy system that can hang together and supply not only clean energy, but also energy access for all and reduce air pollution at the same time, what that would look like and make all of the numbers add up by the target year. And there's been an overwhelming reaction, I would say, in the press around the world. I'm sure that many of you will have seen some of the reporting relating in particular to the need for oil and gas fields. But I'm going to concentrate here a little bit on the expansion of hydrogen in that single scenario that we put together. And what these results, I think, show is what the potential role is of hydrogen in a world in which we have also, tried to push all of the other available levers that will be cost effective in different sectors in order to reduce the use of fossil fuels and the emissions from fossil fuels in all of the different sectors that it touches. It really is a fairly heroic piece of modeling from our point of view, and we were able then to pull out what the hydrogen demand was in all of these different sectors, compare it with what demand is today, and look at what share of that demand is low carbon in each of the years that I show on the slide here. So I hope everybody can understand from the legend what the different colors are. I'm not going to dwell on explaining that too much. I just wanted to say that 500 million tons of hydrogen being consumed with almost 100% low carbon hydrogen. So that's hydrogen from the electrolysis of water using renewable or nuclear energy, or from hydrogen production with fossil fuels, in particular, natural gas combined with CO2 capture and storage. So 500 million tons is an awful lot of hydrogen. And that is roughly equivalent to, I think, 1,500 million tons of oil equivalent, if you understand those terms. But it's essentially, I think, a half of today's natural gas industry globally. It's all of the natural gas that is consumed directly without being converted into electricity first globally. And the electricity that would be needed to produce that much hydrogen is roughly equal to the total electricity demand of the world today. We don't use electricity in our model to produce all of that hydrogen. We use an amount of electricity that is still larger than all of the electricity demand of the United States and China today. So these are very large amounts. And it's not because we've tried to maximize the use of hydrogen. I wanted to impress upon you these large numbers and then say that this is what we find once we've tried to maximize the direct use of electricity wherever possible in order to maintain the efficiency of the energy system and reduce emissions that way. and also use bioenergy and carbon capture, utilization, and storage to the extent that we think are reasonable and cost effective in a scenario like this. We do also, of course, have other scenarios that are perhaps less ambitious in terms of the emissions reduction, and those two, we're starting to integrate more hydrogen into those because we see the potential and we see that costs are likely to come down. So if we are seeing this amount of hydrogen in our model, there must be a good reason. And I've taken a moment on the next slide to put together the reasons for that. Why is there so much interest in hydrogen at the moment when perhaps there wasn't a huge amount of interest 5 years ago, let's say? And it's still the case if you do a Google text search on hydrogen, you'll find a much bigger peak around 2004, I think, than you find today. But there was a trough, and now there's an enormous amount of interest again. And the main reason is just that if you use hydrogen for energy, whether you're using it in a fuel cell or combusting it, it does not produce carbon dioxide. And that's crucially important when we start to talk about these pledges that countries are making that aim for net zero emissions by 2050, in the case of China, 2060, but these much more ambitious pledges. That is really forcing attention onto pushing fossil fuels right out of the system at the point of consumption, and it forces people to really think about the role of hydrogen. If countries are making a net zero pledge, clearly Canada is one of those countries, but they're not the only one, then they're in the world of the 500 million tons of hydrogen in our model. I have then said, well, okay, well, let's unpack that a little. Why hydrogen in terms of the things that it can do for us? And we think that there are 6 reasons why hydrogen is tackling challenges that it's very, very hard to tackle in other ways. Hydrogen is reaching parts of the energy system that are hard to decarbonize, so-called hard to abate sectors in some cases. In other cases, it's related to flexibility. So number 1, how do you reach very high levels of variable renewable electricity? That's mostly solar and wind. By using long duration storage and flexible power generation, hydrogen is something that can be used to store electricity for long periods, and it can be then burned, whether as hydrogen or perhaps as ammonia, in power generation to provide very fast response. Number 2, how can we replace coal and gas in heavy industries like refining, steel, chemical production, and indeed providing the heat for cement plants? Hydrogen can do that. Electricity cannot reach the heat levels in many cases, and it cannot provide the reducing agents for steel. Number 3, how can we avoid some of the costs and challenges of electrifying nearly all land-based transport? So in our scenario, we get up, I think, to something like a quarter of all of the trucks sold in 2050 are electric, battery electric. But in order to decarbonize by 2050, we do see a role for hydrogen in much of the other parts of the truck market globally, alongside bioenergy. Number 4, how do we maintain the benefits of market-based trade and energy to balance long-term and short-term regional imbalances? This is kind of an energy security argument, but there are great benefits that we have at the moment to being able to ship energy around the world and to have it arrive on demand and not have to store it all the way from summer to winter, and to be able to rely on that and to have the efficiencies of markets. Hydrogen is something that can potentially do that, whereas electricity, it's much harder to envisage that, especially intercontinentally. I've also put here that hydrogen is something that can allow air transport to continue in a world where we see limits on the level of bioenergy and potentially the limits on carbon removal. Air transport is something that everybody relies on, wants to be able to rely on in future. There's tremendous benefits to it, but it is problematic in terms of the emissions, as everybody knows. And then the final one really is an argument around heating for buildings, but also some light industry. There are major challenges in terms of infrastructure and societal behavioral challenges around the switching that would be needed to full electrification, not to mention the having the right capacity on the grid to be able to supply people on the coldest day of the year. And hydrogen can help us to mitigate having to tackle full on all of those challenges. So that is, a real mixed basket of roles that hydrogen can play. It's not one thing at all. It has in the past been closely associated with fuel cells and that type of electric vehicle. That is really not the case anymore. And a lot of the strategies we see are talking about scale up, mostly through replacing, hydrogen that is produced today from fossil fuels in the industrial applications I mentioned there in point 2. It's reasonable after that nice list to then ask, why not hydrogen? And there are reasons why you could be skeptical about hydrogen. I've listed some of them here, and I think that they all need to be considered very, very carefully when putting together a hydrogen strategy or when thinking about what hydrogen competes with. But the truth is, when we look at a net zero world and we ask the question, why not hydrogen? Then, we have to shrug your shoulders and think there are no solutions currently that allow you to avoid hydrogen in meeting those severe targets by a year like 2050. So we're very much come around to the opinion that there's a big role for hydrogen to play in each of these 6 areas. So I am going to now just shift gears a little bit, try and give a bit of a rundown of where we are today and then a couple of the challenges that are faced. We are producing at the IEA this year our first global hydrogen review, which will be released in September, which is going to become an annual publication that's going to track hydrogen. We've previously been tracking bits and pieces of hydrogen in our investment reports and other parts of IEA outputs. We're going to bring it all together. And here's just a quick summary of some of the things that we see on that dashboard of things. The momentum around hydrogen is really unprecedented. And I think it's really worth saying that this could be a hype cycle, but it's going to be a much bigger one than we have ever seen before, and it's unlikely to break and go back into the trough that we saw maybe 5 years ago. We've got countries that are publishing hydrogen strategies. Canada is one of them, but we know of 18 under development that would take the total to 30 around the world. I've been this week trying to add up some of the equity that's been raised by hydrogen companies, whether they're startups or some of those that are post-IPO. And I think that since 2019, around 8 billion has been invested directly in companies that are producing hydrogen equipment as their main line of business, which is quite remarkable, to be honest, for a technology or a market that isn't really off the ground yet. The chart here on the right just shows that in 2021, if the projects that are claiming to be operational this year do become operational, we're going to see a huge step up in the number of electrolyzers coming online. And also, we're becoming much more diverse in what that hydrogen is being used for from those electrolyzers. There's still a large amount that are paired with vehicles, but increasingly things like electricity storage and synthetic fuels are coming into that mix. And that's real money that's going into real projects. And some of them are getting up to the scales of the one that you have in Canada already. Manufacturing is really a thing to watch, and we're going to hear from GE and Cummins, but we think there's around 3 gigawatts today. It's been hard to get the numbers out of China, but we know of projects that are seeking to raise that to 9 gigawatts. If we don't have the manufacturing capacity, we're not going to have the projects putting steel in the ground by 2050, in line with the our scenario, but also in line with the big ambitions of regions like the European Union that are talking about 80 gigawatts by 2030. And that's paired with new announcements that we're seeing quite regularly on projects using CCUS. And of course, the costs remain high, and I think it's just worth mentioning that even in the optimistic pathways that would have costs of the capex for the electrolyzers coming down, the input costs, whether it's the gas for the CCUS plants or the electricity for the electrolyzers, is really the thing that's going to keep hydrogen above natural gas prices, into the 2030s. And that, I think, is where attention needs to also be placed. Make sure that we've got the renewables costs coming down, but also that those renewables projects are additional and in many cases dedicated to hydrogen production. So I'd like to leave you with a few thoughts on where next for hydrogen. I mentioned the Global Hydrogen Review already. That's our little where next. but that's going to include some policy recommendations. And we're going to be talking about things like how do you create bankable and dependable demand for the equipment in particular, for getting these investments in the supply chain that allow the manufacturing capacity to get built. And we've really seen some quite remarkable developments. Countries like Germany, just yesterday, I think it was, announced a new auction mechanism that would give people certainty over the price that they might be expecting to get for hydrogen produced, and try and stimulate demand for the equipment itself. We think that the equipment, the manufacturing of the equipment is the key thing to watch. But on the demand side, existing hydrogen demand is the right place to start, where the infrastructure is already in place and there's disruptions to contracting in the value chain can be minimized. I just wanted to mention that the SEM Hydrogen Initiative of the Clean Energy Ministerial, which the IEA runs, is looking on that in relation to ports in particular. Certification of hydrogen is my number 2, and the International Partnership for a Hydrogen Economy is the intergovernmental group that is looking at that. And we'd like to see that cutting across all low carbon gases and looking at upstream methane emissions and biogas alongside hydrogen certification and renewable green certificates. Lastly, quickly mention the fact that when it comes to buildings, when it comes to legacy infrastructure like gas pipelines, a plan needs to be in place for the owners of that infrastructure and what's going to happen to it in the long term, and when there might need to be switching. Without those kinds of plans, it's going to be very difficult to invest. And lastly, I put up the logo for MI, for Mission Innovation here. There's a need globally to make sure that we're efficient in the way that we test the technology and the regulatory configurations. So I hope those things have given a little bit of food for thought and a high-level overview. And I'd like to hand back to Tara now and hear from the other contributors. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. That was a great presentation. I'm sure that people are writing questions as we speak. As a reminder, if you have any questions, please type them into the question box and we'll get to them after the presentations. Second on our list, I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Jeff Goldmeer. Dr. Goldmeer is an Emergent Technologies Director at GE Gas and Power. Jeff is responsible for developing and executing strategies for the decarbonization of gas turbine-based power plants. His primary focus on the use of hydrogen as a zero carbon power generation fuel, supporting the company's vision of accelerating decarbonization with gas turbine technology. Jeff brings more than 19 years of experience in the energy industry, holding several senior roles at GE. Jeff is a recognized industry speaker on the use of alternative fuels for power gen and is also co-creator and co-host of GE's new podcast, Cutting Carbon. Prior to joining GE, Jeff was a senior research scientist at Southwest Sciences and an NRC researcher at the NASA Glenn Research Center. He received his PhD in mechanical engineering from Case Western Reserve University. And an interesting fact is that Jeff's PhD research at NASA focused on extinguishing fires in a low gravity environment as part of his research. Jeff performed these experiments on board NASA's Reduced Gravity Lab, aka the Vomit Comet. Jeff, we're happy to have you here today. Please start your presentation.
Tara, I want to thank you and the entire staff at the Institute for extending an invitation for me to participate in this session today. I'm really excited to hear, not just from the other panelists, but to hear the questions from the audience. This is such an engaging and important topic in the world today. Look, where I really want to start us is to think about kind of the key issues around decarbonization as we think about utilizing existing infrastructure. And in this case, let's talk about the use of gas turbines, which can provide a backbone for our energy ecosystem. But we need to do so thinking about all the technologies we have available to us today, especially as we look towards decarbonization and how we all achieve these net zero goals. So if we think about the technologies that we have in our toolbox today, wind and solar are among the fastest growing technologies in the power sector. They're being driven because not just of the zero carbon element, which is critical, but low cost. Gas turbines or gas technology will continue to play a critical role as a dispatchable and flexible technology and one that can be decarbonized. We'll talk about that. We can't ignore the need and the development happening around storage and hybrid systems. We need to continue to think about the use of nuclear. You know, in many parts of the world, nuclear power provides carbon-free power in a large segment of the industry. And then clearly, you know, we kind of take for granted that, you know, power is produced at point A and we consume it at point B, but in between we have a grid which provides a resilient system that we all kind of take for granted. And along with that, you know, the digital systems that make that possible. And obviously we've seen some recent reminders of how critical digital is, especially in a world of cyber and cyber threats where we need to protect the resiliency of these systems. So we think about all of these together as a toolbox. But ultimately, if we're going to talk and focus on the specific equipment around gas turbines, you know, we can really think of this as having a portfolio of technologies available. And you can really think about this in one of two ways. We can think about them as pre-combustion and post-combustion. And pre-combustion is as simple as, let's just remove the carbon from the fuel. So you have a fuel with no carbon, or you have a fuel whose carbon has been recycled from the environment. So, you know, as we talk hydrogen and Simon kind of mentioned before, right? Hydrogen can come from different production methodologies. You can electrolyze water. You can reform natural gas and take the CO2 that you've captured and put it back into the ground. If you're electrolyzing water, you could do so, whether it be from renewable power or nuclear power. So lots of different pathways to make hydrogen. But we should also not forget there's pathways to make synthetic and renewable natural gas. There are biofuels. There's a lot of discussion around once you've gotten hydrogen, transforming it to ammonia for transportation. And then the next logical question is, if you can transport hydrogen via ammonia, can you use the ammonia now as your end fuel, your end use point? But we also should take and recognize post-combustion. And post-combustion basically says, don't change your upstream fuel infrastructure at all. Continue burning natural gas as you've done in the past. But before the emissions from the gas turbine reach the environment, capture them. And there are a lot of technologies available today using both liquids or solids that have an affinity for capturing carbon. And once you've captured the carbon, you put it to industrial use. You can use it for enhanced oil and gas recovery, or just do sequestration and storage. So lots of technologies that are available here. Again, if we think of this as a suite or an ensemble of tools. You know, one of the questions that we get asked a lot is, can you leverage hydrogen as a power generation fuel? Is that something that can be leveraged and done? And the answer is, not only can you do it, it's been done for 30+ years all over the world. You know, so General Electric, as an example of the industry, has more than 75 gas turbines that have run on hydrogen or hydrogen blends. Those units have accumulated more than 6 million operating hours in a variety of traditionally industrial type sectors. Again, steel mill, refining, places where there has been extra hydrogen, either as a waste product or such. And we've done it from concentrations as low as 5% all the way up to 100%. We have gas turbines that have in excess of 100,000 operating hours on fuels like this. And so, again, this is not a new concept or technology. What's new is that we're not talking about a waste fuel. We're now talking about intentionally generating large amounts of hydrogen. The sole purpose of using that as a carbon-free or low-carbon-based fuel for producing power. And that's the real change in the industry. The gas turbine ultimately doesn't care whether it's blue hydrogen or pink hydrogen or gray or white. It only cares what comes into it in terms of energy content and composition. So that's just good news as we think about leveraging this technology and reaching our zero carbon or net zero carbon goals. I want to reflect on the fact that hydrogen is not a drop-in fuel. You just cannot take hydrogen into an existing system, whether it's an internal combustion engine, a gas turbine system, and just swap it out for methane. It has different energy densities, it has different combustion characteristics, both in terms of reactivity as well as the temperature it burns at, and those have implications we need to consider as we think about entire power plant configurations, entire power plant designs. We need to be cognizant of that. The good news is you can make changes to systems and you can update systems accordingly. So we're not talking about a carbon lock-in scenario. I want to give just 3 examples here as a way to kind of answer questions that we regularly get from customers and developers and regulators around the world. The first is, if you have an existing power plant that's burning natural gas or distillate fuel oil, could you convert that to running on some blend of hydrogen? And the answer is yes. The example I'm showing here is of a power project we did over a decade ago in the US, where we took 4 existing gas turbines that ran on natural gas and converted them to running on a blend with hydrogen. Second question we get is it commercially viable? Do you have examples of power plants that have run on very high levels of hydrogen? And the answer again is yes. This is a picture of a power plant in Asia. It's roughly a 44 megawatt gas turbine. It has run on a blend of fuels where the hydrogen concentration has been as low as 70% and in excess on the upper end of 95%. When we checked on this plant last summer, the hydrogen content was about 85%. This unit has well over 100,000 hours of experience, so you can operate a plant commercially on very high levels of hydrogen. But as we talked about, right, the paradigm shift, going from having hydrogen as a waste product to now intentionally getting hydrogen for the sole purpose of reducing the carbon footprint of your power plant. And the last column here gives a specific example of that. This is a project in the US, in the state of Ohio. It's called the Long Ridge Energy Terminal. The project was announced a number of years ago, but what was new was the announcement last year that the project, when it goes into commercial operation later this year, will start to run on a blend of hydrogen and natural gas. And the owners have announced publicly their intent to take that gas turbine and over time ramp that level of hydrogen from 5% all the way up to 100. So you can think about doing commercial scale, utility scale power projects with the intent of using hydrogen to lower your carbon footprint. What I'm very proud to announce today that I could not put in the draft presentation was GE has now publicly announced a project we are doing in Australia, very similar to this Long Ridge project, where we are going to take a brand new gas turbine and we are going to, sorry about that, a brand new gas turbine in Australia, the Tallawarra B project. And this project, when it goes into commercial operation, will again start using a blend of hydrogen and natural gas for the purpose specifically of reducing the carbon footprint of that plant in support of renewables. So this concept of using hydrogen as a way to start achieving our net zero goals is very critical. But I think what Simon mentioned earlier is also true. We have to recognize this trilemma of production, infrastructure, and cost. In order for hydrogen to be viable as a power generation fuel, we have to produce it at very high scale. We have to be able to transport it to the point of end use, whether that's power, whether that's for electrifying industries where heat is required, or to decarbonizing industries where heat is required. And it has to be at a rational, competitive cost. The reason you don't see power plants burning hydrogen today is not because the gas turbines can't do it, it's because you can't get hydrogen at a supply at a price point that makes it viable. So, we talk about blue hydrogen and gray hydrogen, but if you think about how much hydrogen you'd need just for the power sector, it's multiple times more than the world already produces today. So if we're talking about using hydrogen for power in a net zero world, we have to think about huge increases in production and infrastructure to make this happen. Look, I wish we had hours to talk about this topic. Unfortunately, we don't today. For those who are interested in learning more about the use of hydrogen in a gas turbine beyond what we can talk about today, the use of carbon capture, GE has published multiple white papers. I encourage you to take a look at those. And as Tara mentioned earlier, I have the good luck of being a co-creator and co-host of a podcast that is solely dedicated to the topic of decarbonization. We are a few weeks away from launching our 3rd season. We've got 24 episodes, we have 12 episodes already queued up, available from your favorite podcasting platform. And we have episodes coming up that are going to talk more about a range of technologies to decarbonize beyond just gas turbines. I'm looking forward to the next presentation as well as to the Q&A. Again, knowing there's probably more questions that can be answered today, I want to provide everyone with my contact information. And again, Tara, I want to thank you and the staff at the Institute for providing me an opportunity to join this panel today. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. That was a great presentation, and I will be checking out the podcast for sure. Thank you also for providing your contact information, because I know that there's going to be a lot of questions and people interested in the content that you provided. So moving along on our program today, the final panelist I would like to welcome is Tracy Krauss. Tracy Krauss is the Director of Government Relations at Cummins, Inc. She represents Cummins as a co-founder of the Hydrogen Forward Coalition, co-chair of the Hydrogen Council Policy and Advocacy Project Team, and chair of the Truck and Engine Manufacturers Association Public Policy Committee. She leads advocacy for Cummins Engine, New Power, Power Systems and Components business units, and product compliance and regulatory affairs, and research and technology functions. She focuses on energy, climate, hydrogen, transportation, budget, and legislative and regulatory issues. Prior to joining Cummins, Tracy worked for U.S. Senator Russ Feingold. She has a master's in public administration from George Washington University and BAs in government and politics and communication from the University of Maryland in College Park. She's originally from Chicago and now lives outside of Washington, D.C. with her husband and 2 children. Welcome, Tracy. We're really looking forward to your presentation. Please begin when you're ready.
Thank you so much. And I am trying to share my webcam, but it is slow. So hopefully you can see me in a moment. And I will, not sure why it's not working. But I wanted to take a little time, and our previous 2 speakers focused on some of the technology and decarbonization implications of hydrogen. And today I wanted to take some time to speak a little bit about why Cummins as a company has invested in hydrogen. And because of my focus in Washington, D.C. and on policy and government, I wanted to take a little bit of time to talk through what sorts of policies we really think are necessary to accelerate hydrogen infrastructure development and deployment. And so I'll start on my first slide by discussing why, who Cummins is. We're an over 100-year-old company, and we are in all sorts of heavy industrial applications where, and I see I've got a little bit of a lag on the slides, but we are in many of the heavy industrial applications that are carbon intensive right now. So we're most known for heavy duty trucking. We also make the only natural gas engines. And we serve a lot of the industries that are carbon intensive, like oil and gas, like mining equipment, agricultural equipment, construction equipment. But we've invested significantly in technology like batteries, hybridization, advanced internal combustion with low carbon fuels, and even electrolysis for hydrogen production and fuel cells to use the hydrogen. So we are really in all of these segments and have a unique view across industry in this space. And I also wanted to talk a little bit about why we've invested in all of these different technologies, like that I just mentioned, advanced diesel, battery electric. And that's because you saw our diverse markets, and each of them really does require unique power needs. And unique job needs. These are work vehicles, they are not passenger vehicles, or they're applications that are critical in the field. For example, we do power generation for Army bases in Afghanistan and other places. So really critical that the power is there when needed. And so we've got just teams, we have over 25,000 employees in the US, over 60,000 globally. And so a lot of engineers focusing on solving some of these problems that Simon and Jeff have talked about previously. And so I also wanted to talk through our commitment to decarbonization as a company. We've set what we call our Planet 2050 aspirational target of net zero carbon emissions in all of our products, facilities, and operations, and having a net positive impact rather in every community in which we operate. And to meet these really ambitious goals, we also have 2030 targets that are more specific and provide for real targets that we intend to meet. And so as we look through how can we accomplish these really ambitious decarbonization goals, hydrogen was just seen across the company as a key enabler in these spaces. And I'll talk a little bit about some of those technologies more specifically that will allow us to reach those decarbonization goals. So batteries obviously have gotten a lot of support, especially in North America. That seems to have taken off a little bit more quickly, especially in the transportation applications where we operate. And there are certainly applications where battery electric vehicles make sense and they're a great technology. Those are things that don't carry a lot of weight, things like transit buses or school buses, medium duty trucks, terminal tractors, material handling equipment, things that that they have time to charge every night, where they're charging, predictable applications. But fuel cell electric vehicles really will be key in the technologies where we see diesel doing a big, as a workhorse today. So things like commercial fleets, Class A long haul trucking, construction, places where there's you need to pay attention to the weight impact, and places where you need a lot of torque. So fuel cells are a key enabler here, and of course hydrogen generation. We are now and I'll talk a little bit about where you can see some of our electrolyzers and the work that we're doing there, but we're creating solutions for industrial and commercial hydrogen generation right now at megawatt scale, but with the ability to scale even further. And we do have all sorts of technologies. Of course, the focus has been on PEM, but alkaline and even solid oxide. So really investing throughout the value chain. We've also partnered with a tank company, Enprox, to really optimize hydrogen storage in a lot of these different applications. So when I tell you that we at Cummins see hydrogen as the key enabler, we are investing heavily. We really do think that this is a key element to decarbonize our operations. And I wanted to talk a little bit about where you can see some of our applications, and we've segmented out. You can see the numbers on these pictures correspond to the technology that they're powered by, but I wanted to focus on the blue and the green segments. So for blue, you can see these are some of our hydrogen fuel cell operations. In fact, number 2 there is the Alstom train. Cummins is now the largest provider of hydrogen fuel cells for rail applications, and these are passenger trains that are running right now in Germany, with plans to deploy in Austria and France and other places in Europe. And we've also had really promising conversations here in the US, where I sit in Washington, DC, with the Department of Transportation and others about ways that we can decarbonize our rail with hydrogen. And I'll note that in some instances, right, if you're doing electric power only, there's a lot more infrastructure requirements to put, electric charging on rail where it doesn't already exist is a really significant investment. And if you can use hydrogen and fuel cells, it is a much more, it can be a more cost-effective solution to completely decarbonize those applications. And then I wanted to point out the second row there and the third row, and those are our electrolyzer applications. And you can see that we have some power to gas applications with Enbridge. We have a 5 megawatt PEM electrolyzer, the largest in the US, in Douglas County, Washington, and actually the largest in North America I will speak to, and that's in Canada in Bécancour. And this is the largest PEM electrolyzer in operation in the world right now. It's a 20 megawatt system generating green hydrogen, or if we're speaking, we're trying to de-emphasize the colors in some instances because it can be confusing. So renewable hydrogen. And our system is installed at the Air Liquide hydrogen production facility in Bécancour in Quebec. And right now it produces, or it can produce, over 3,000 tons of hydrogen each year, and it runs on hydropower. And so we heard from previous speakers about the real importance of cost in achieving scale. And you see, I mentioned our facility, our electrolyzer in Douglas County, Washington, and then in Bécancour, and they both run on hydropower, and that's because the cost. It is a relatively cheap renewable, and so it makes a lot of sense to use that and to generate hydrogen. So as the cost of renewables go down, I mentioned hydrogen is the key enabler, we can really achieve a more significant scale. And then I wanted to focus on what my real bread and butter is in the work that I do, advocating with governments for hydrogen policy to accelerate deployment. And we look at these things that I've laid out here as the real building blocks. These are global, right? These are things that can be done in every country. They're not specific to any one tax structure or mechanism that any one country has. But the first thing that we advocate for is the importance of national strategies. And I know that we have regional strategies in Canada. The US is behind on this. There's an industry strategy. The Department of Energy has a strategy, but there is no cross-government strategy that sets targets to implement. And I'm seeing that my camera went out, so I'll click that again. It's also critical to reduce demand uncertainty. And one way that we can do that is to, not only set those targets in the national strategy, but to also create mechanisms by which, we facilitate deployment of technologies for that hydrogen offtake, whether that's in fields like fertilizer or ammonia, or even in the processes that are currently using gray or hydrogen from SMR. It's also critical to invest in infrastructure. So we're seeing in the US some movement on that, whether it's through the Biden American Jobs Plan or some of the other actions that the administration is trying to take. But really, hydrogen is only useful as you can use it, as the infrastructure exists. There's still continued research and development needed. So while it's clear that hydrogen is really at a commercialization phase that I think it hadn't been, and I'm sure we've all heard the old joke that hydrogen has been 10 years away for the past 50 years. But there are certainly still places to optimize in materials, in efficiencies. I believe in Simon's presentation earlier, he talked about why not hydrogen. And of course, there are still challenges, inefficiencies in some of these other places that we should and will continue to do some research on, just as we're continuing to do research in internal combustion, a technology that's over 100 years old. Accelerating deployment is key. And so we can do that by sort of, policies that we would recommend are beyond just hydrogen, but rather internalizing the social cost of carbon. So pricing carbon in some way to really start to those diffuse societal impacts that carbon has, to internalize those into the cost of actually using it, will go a long way towards accelerating deployment of the technologies that can address that challenge. And then finally, we heard a little bit about this. I know Germany is undergoing some of this work, but implementing really global common definitions, codes, and standards is key to enabling adoption. We talk about, you've heard the colors of hydrogen, right? There's green, there's blue, there's gray, there's pink, I've heard turquoise. Those can be effective in settings like this, where we're trying to convey technologies in a quick way to a number of people, but to really align globally on some common definitions for hydrogen production, guarantees of origin, some of these schemes that are necessary to actually facilitate the global movement and usage of hydrogen. And finally, I did just want to focus on some of the, and I see I'm still having some connection issues, so if you can't see me, I apologize, but how governments can really promote that adoption in that infrastructure development and deployment, which we do think are the key. I mentioned the 6 key building blocks, but these pieces are critical. So the National Hydrogen Strategy really undergirds all of these things, and it sets targets and it sets certainty, so companies like mine can continue to invest and to understand the art of the possible and what our aims can be, and know that if we're investing in this equipment, this technology, this deployment, that we're not the only ones in the value chain, and it's not a sunk cost or a lost asset. So focusing on things like hydrogen production and fueling, in the US, we see a Senate finance bill that's got some pretty robust tax credits to do just that. I talked about the importance of research and development, and still the work that needs to happen to continue that commercialization. And there's also a focus in the US and in Canada and other places on promoting that domestic capability. Excuse me. And that's because, we've seen the impacts of different global energy markets and geopolitics that come along with energy. And one of the reasons hydrogen has been so attractive to governments is because it can be domestically produced anywhere, and especially anywhere that has cheap and available renewable power. So there's a real geopolitical reason that hydrogen is popular as well. And finally, deployment, some more specifics, right? Governments can and should support purchase of fuel cell electric vehicles, of decarbonized products like ammonia or fertilizer, and really that government support to decarbonize these hard to abate sectors. And so governments really should, we've got some long papers that we've worked on, whether it's with the Hydrogen Council or some of these other groups that lay out very specific ways we can address all of these. Happy to answer any questions about it. Of course, I've got a real book of policies that we suggest governments adopt, but given my limited time today, I just wanted to lay out what we really think that the key pieces are there. So really do appreciate being invited and able to speak to you all today and enjoying the presentation. Thank you. Oh, national strategies, I did have more. And this is just an outline of where those national strategies are in place. And you can see the little flag pins, and of course, many places like the US, California have industry roadmaps. And as you move further down this national strategy snake, you can see where East Asia and Europe were really, this is a more advanced discussion. And that's because they have things like carbon pricing or different carbon mechanisms in place, just a little more advanced. And you can also see that those places might be more geopolitically impacted by energy, needing energy production, domestic energy production. So just to tie it back to some of the why in there. I think that was it. Yes.
Thank you, Tracy. That was really great. I'm sure everyone will agree that government does have a huge role in enabling the technologies and uptake of technologies through policy and regulation. So I think that's still a developing area that we're going to see emerge from hydrogen. So I think right now, I would just like, before we go to the next section, and I'm mindful of time as well, we just have a very short poll question. We're going to just take about 30 seconds or so to answer that. I want to thank Jeff and Simon as well for taking the time to be part of our presentation today and for their valuable contributions to this discussion. So if everyone could just take a quick moment to read our poll, we're going to give you about 30 seconds and then we will move on to the Q&A section. So I think if you've got your responses in, we'll probably wrap that up. And we can see that cost and funding is two of the highlighted areas that I think most of our audience has indicated today. So for the next 7 or so minutes that we have left, I apologize, we don't have as much time for questions as I would like. But one of our questions is to all the panelists, asking if they can share their thoughts on the pros and cons of blending natural gas, hydrogen into the natural gas distribution systems and converting natural gas infrastructure to hydrogen. The question is, can existing natural gas pipelines really handle being used for distribution of hydrogen? And I will let one of the panelists jump in here.
Tara, this is Jeff. I can take a first go at that. So, depending on where you are in the world, there are limits to how much hydrogen the existing natural gas infrastructure can support. There's kind of, to use the fairy tales analogy, there's kind of the Goldilocks kind of metallurgy. The metallurgy is old enough and it's had enough cycles. You may not want to put too much hydrogen in it. Newer metals, depending on the system, may not have the right compatibility, but there may be a sweet spot of a combination of both age and metallurgy that work. But it's very, very regional and country and site specific. But so let's just imagine you can do, let's say, 20% hydrogen to an existing natural gas pipeline. If you just look at the differences in heating value between natural gas and hydrogen, if you were to put that into a power generation system like a gas turbine, the problem is you only result in about a 6 or 7% reduction in CO2 emissions. So the question becomes, if you have a lot of hydrogen available, is putting it into the natural gas pipeline system the right way to reduce, to maximize the reduction of carbon emissions? Again, it's a bang for the buck kind of question. If you have the hydrogen, where's the right place to use it initially? Mm-hmm. If we're 100% hydrogen, you're probably going to need new pipelines or to renovate, existing pipelines with liners or just to replace existing pipes.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think part of the conversation that a lot of people are having is what is the best use of that hydrogen, and is it better to electrify directly rather than, use hydrogen as a replacement? Okay, our next question is creating hydrogen from natural gas emits large quantities of CO2. Is the current state of CCS technology up to the task of creating a green hydrogen economy? Simon, I might direct that to you.
Okay, I'll take that. I'm just going to first make a little additional contribution to what Jeff said on the previous question, because
Absolutely.
there's one thing that he didn't mention, which is what's the potential role of blending in the next 10 years for scaling up demand for hydrogen. Having an existing infrastructure into which the hydrogen can be directly injected, even if it's at low percentages, is a huge opportunity to create the off-takers and the contracts for hydrogen as we get the businesses set up and the investments in the production of hydrogen and the supply. So I just wanted to make that quick point, because it's a slightly separate one, and it's one that we do integrate into our modeling. On the question of CCS and where we stand with that, we're bullish about the technology on CCS, partly because it exists and you can go out and you can kick its wheels in the field. In Canada, in Alberta, you have the Shell Quest project, which is the application of CO2 capture technology to a hydrogen production plant at an upgrader in the oil sands. It captures the CO2, it transports it to a storage site, and it stores it in a geological formation underground. And from a technological perspective, it's been operating very well. I think the twist that I would put onto this is that in order to have a level playing field competition between different hydrogen supplies that all offer a very high level of CO2 reduction in the future, we'd like to see the capture rate, so the percentage of the CO2 that is captured from these plants that produce hydrogen from fossil fuels, get up to 90% and above 90%. Many of them today that are there, they're operating, they're working well, but they're capturing the easy bit, which is around 60%. So we have no doubt that the technology is possible, but we are also honest about some of the political and financial challenges to put it in place everywhere in the world.
Great, thank you. And I think this next question will probably direct primarily to Tracy. Do you foresee hydrogen or natural gas blends being used in natural gas vehicles?
Absolutely. You know, I will clarify, I am not an engineer, but certainly I think we are very curious and looking into hydrogen for internal combustion generally, whether it's in our spark ignited natural gas engine or it has its own engine. You know, I think we're very, very intrigued by all of the possibilities of ways that we can utilize existing technology and hydrogen to really decarbonize. You know, we will be there when it's all fuel cell electric vehicles, or when there's a portion of fuel cell electric vehicles, but there is no reason that we can't start decarbonizing along the way. And that's why, of course, we are doing projects with gas and hydrogen blending in you know, pipelines, but also in vehicles, looking at the possibilities there. So I do, you know, because I think we are at time, I will end us on this positive note that I do think there are a lot of options for hydrogen, and Cummins is interested in all of them and ways that we can reduce the carbon intensity of all the areas that we operate as soon as possible. So absolutely low carbon fuels, including hydrogen, in a variety of applications is something that we're interested in.
Great, thank you. I think we are coming on time. I just want to again thank all of our speakers today. Thank you, Jeff, Simon, and Tracy, for taking the time to spend with us during this webinar. I think you've provided some very good information, and we will have lots of follow-up, I'm sure, on some of the topics that you brought up today. I'd also like to just thank our regional directors, Karen Tamwu, Simon Dyer, Colton Castile, and Melissa Hudson, our Pembina team, for helping with today's event. Just as a reminder, this webinar will be posted on the webinar on our pembina.org website. Please join us next week. June 30th at 10, we'll have a special presentation just on decarbonizing heavy duty transportation. Thank you to all our guests and audience and for joining us, and have a great rest of the day. Thank you so much. Bye-bye. So I think we're still on.